Hello, and welcome to today's plenary, Racial Justice and the Mission of Jesuit Higher Education. My name is Shiu, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching, and Service at Georgetown University. My pronouns are he, him. I'm excited today to join you all in our racial justice conversation with our panelists. With all that is happening in the world as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, this conversation is essential and relevant as ever. As we sit here over 1 year after the murder of Mr. George Floyd, and as acts of violence and oppression against BIPOC folks have continued, we must each individually work towards racial justice. Additionally, as parts of institutions of Jesuit higher education, we must look at how we can become anti-racist organizations and actors. We are living through what I have heard described as a centuries-long pandemic of white supremacy and oppression that we each and collectively have responsibility to dismantle. And as members of Jesuit higher education, we must come to terms with our own institution's historic complicity with white supremacy, with our direct involvement in slavery, and how we as institutions perpetuate oppressive practices, sometimes inadvertently through what we think are efforts towards justice. I believe each of us can spend time reflecting on ways that we have made strides in advancing racial justice, and reflect on ways that we have come up short. I've been at Georgetown and in Jesuit higher education for 17 years now. I can remember times in the community on campus that I've contributed and times that I did not. Times where I served as an ally and as an educator, and times where I suffered through racist acts and microaggression. It's panels like today that I look forward to so I can continue to learn, grow, and share. You can read more about our speakers in the conference materials, but allow me to name our panelists. Dr. Kay Whitehead, Associate Professor of Communication, African and African American Studies at Loyola University, Maryland. Keisha Middlemass, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University. Melisande Short-Colum, Community Engagement Associate at the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics at Georgetown. And Yohura Williams, Distinguished University Chair, Professor of History and Founding Director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. After the plenary, please join us for a live Zoom Q&A session with the panelists and examine with Julia Vargas.
Welcome to the Call to Reconciliation and Racial Justice, a panel designed to examine, to explore, and perhaps even answer the nation's call to address systemic racism in society and culture. These are buzzwords, and for a lot of people, they really have no idea what does it mean when we talk about systemic racism. We're going to explore that today and think about what it means at our own institutions of higher education and what it means in our life and in our work. I'm Dr. Kay Whitehead, the founding director of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice. And I'm joined by Dr. Keisha Middlemass, an associate professor at Howard University in the Department of Political Science. She studies public policies, the criminal justice system, and prison reentry. She thinks deeply about race, politics, and the intersection of public policy. So Dr. Keisha, when you think about a call for reconciliation and racial justice, what exactly are you hearing in that call that the nation is now making?
I'm really hearing this call to actually rethink what has happened in the past and to reimagine what is going on now, to take into consideration race, but also the intersection of race and gender. Black women are the fastest growing group that are actually being incarcerated, which means that they're also the fastest growing group coming home after serving time. And so when I think about reconciliation and race, I'm really thinking about who is impacted and how can we best then help those individuals that have been impacted by various systems and policies.
Dr. Yohura Williams is also joining us, a distinguished university chair and professor of history and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. I was wondering, Dr. Yohura, when we think about intersectionality and the ways in which race and gender come together, part of that tension from Kimberly Crenshaw are the ways in which we tend to focus on the pain of Black men and not really enter Black women into this space. Can you talk about that tension and how we can make sure that space is opened up for people of all genders?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. In fact, I think that's one of the things that I've appreciated about the Black Lives Matter movement and the women who ultimately are the drivers of that movement, why it's so different than anything we've seen in the past, because it really, I think, forefronts intersectionality in a way that forces us to confront the myriad ways in which racial identity in this country and the wound is often expressed around what happens to Black men. We saw this last year, unfortunately, with the killing of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, which received a lot of national attention. And while ultimately Breonna Taylor got the same level of attention, it wasn't directed or focused in the same way that the Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd case were. And that's a good indication. For me, during the trial of Derek Chauvin, one of the most interesting moments was the testimony of Alicia, who was the young woman who worked at the service station across the street. And she was talking about the dynamic of what happened when the police come in the community. But it was interesting to have that be a female voice, someone who dropped out of school at the 11th grade, who is a portrait of everything that's wrong with America when we talk about the other America, the invisibility of the poor and people of color. And then, of course, I think it was very powerful that when you think about the witnesses who lined up on the sidewalk and challenged Derek Chauvin, it was Black men and women and white women. And it's an indication in our society to the degree to which women and people of color, Black people, are still very much silenced in the larger society and culture. So it's an important moment for us, as you said, Dr. Whitehead, to connect the dots there and to recognize the ways in which we have to move beyond this kind of focus on just what happens to Black men and framing that in historical context and looking at this broader picture if we're really going to talk about dismantling and reconciliation.
And I'm also joined by Millicent Short-Colomb, a research and community engagement associate with Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, and a descendant of Jesuit enslavement and human trafficking. Millicent, I have to ask you, what do you think we can do to begin to hold all institutions accountable for the ways in which they profited off the pain and the enslavement of Black people and are now profiting off the pain, the oppression of Black and Brown people?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking me. I think a forensic audit of all of the institutions that exist today and those that were lost to the financial failure of 1929, 2008, and a world economic forensic deep dive into the systems that were in existence, the institutions that were in existence, the colleges and universities that were in existence in 1865.
Dr. Uhuru, which makes me come back to you because I'm thinking about this notion of reconciliation, of accountability, and of reparations. Three things that should exist in the same space, but there seems to be a lot of tension here. So I want more than just accountability. And I think for Black and Brown folks, we want more than just an apology. So what does reconciliation and reparations, beyond just writing folks a check, which I'm okay with, what would that actually look like to help our communities?
I really appreciate that question, Dr. Whitehead, because I think it gets to the heart of the problem, which is that it's very easy to apologize for past injustice, and people are very willing to do this. We saw this with President Clinton with the apology for slavery years ago, where he apologized to people on the continent of Africa, but not to the African descendants of slavery here in the United States. The apology is easy. It doesn't require anything other than an expression of contrition about what happened at some abstract place in the past, which we had no control over. It doesn't look to the ramifications of that in our contemporary moment, how those policies, practices, and procedures have continued to exert harm on communities of color in tangible ways, which are justiciable, which can be redressed if we think about it in a variety of ways. You mentioned the one that often comes to mind for people, which is writing a check. But there's also, dealing with problems in the educational system, access to healthcare, what I like to call the 6 degrees of segregation, housing, education, access to places of public accommodation, Jim Crow justice, unfair labor practices, and voting rights. And if we think about it in that way, you certainly would be in a space where accountability doesn't simply mean that you're ticking a box and saying, we got justice this time in the case of Officer Derek Chauvin. It's reimagining the criminal justice system in a way that Maryland seems to be moving toward now, where you're getting rid of qualified immunity. You're dealing with the issue of how police systems were created to enforce segregation, and tackling those issues in a tangible way that you're really then doing the work of dismantling, which is critical. So I'm with you. I think that the three of those terms have to be discussed in concert, and they have to be discussed in continuum, because it's going to be a longitudinal engagement. An apology, that moment's past. We need much more than that. And oh, by the way, as we're having this conversation about African Americans, we need to also have it about Indigenous people as well. And I know that very intimately living here in Minnesota, where that's as much a part of the landscape as it is the racial divide, and talking about the Black-white dichotomy.
Dr. Keisha, I'll come to you because it makes me think when we reach these spaces where we're having this conversation, one of the things that historically happens is that Black folks of wealth and means send their children to HBCUs. I mean, we did it during the 60s going, we need our children to be in safe environments. And we're seeing a return to that practice, not just at Howard, but at Spelman, at Lincoln, at Morgan, that we have this guilt money being poured into the HBCUs. And then we see Black folks sending their children there. Can you talk about why it's important to have our children in these environments where they can have, as Carter G. Woodson said, have their genius sparked?
So the students at Howard University, 99% of them identify as Black, African American, or African from the actual continent. And they come to campus without having to explain their racial identity. They are accepted for who they are as they show up. They are not the only one in the classroom and are expected, like at predominantly white institutions, when there's not a large group of Black students, one Black student in a class may actually be asked to speak for the entire Black nation, whatever that looks like, but speak for all the Black experiences. And at Howard, we don't have to do that. We automatically start with an individual's identity, and then we layer that on in terms of making sure that their identity does not then restrict them to access to internships, access to advanced classes. They're thought of as brilliant upon entry, and not having to prove themselves later on via exams or how we evaluate students.
So Millicent, I mean, I'm thinking now, because I know you're at Georgetown University, and as we think about universities being held accountable, could you draw and paint the picture for us about the connections between human trafficking and the ongoing oppression of Black and Brown people, so that people can see there's a direct line here where it connects?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Whitehead. First, I'd like to say that ours as a society, whether you came here in 1619 or your uncle threw you across the fence yesterday, everybody comes here voluntarily. There has been but one group of people in America who came here, many people, as in the way of immigration, who lost their freedom to laws that were created because of the color of their skin. And we continue to exist under that dichotomy today, unchanged. This inheritance is not only the inheritance of descendants of enslaved people, it is the inheritance of every American who comes here. And most people came because they believed that there was something better here that would bring you here under extreme circumstances to have what we have here. Is that propaganda? Yeah, a lot of it is. But when did America open its doors to immigrants from around the world in vast numbers? 1970. And that started with the Vietnamese boat people. Chinese men before that were the last group of people to be shanghaied in China and enslaved in America to build the railroad in the West after enslavement. So ours is a collective societal inheritance that should not be assigned only to repairing Black and brown and poor people in America, but also repairing racism. Because I can't be okay if y'all out there being crazy.
So now with that, because Dr. Uhuru, so Millicent Sanders put 1619 on the table. I mean, and we have to address this. So whether you are a 1619er, you know, and you're in Jamestown, Virginia, or you're 1526 in South Carolina, depending upon where you stand, because I know there's tension there. The real issue is that critical race theory is under fire now, that there is a deliberate intention in the profile of white supremacists to keep that teaching out of the schools. Can you, Dr. Uhuru, help people understand white supremacy at work? A word that gets thrown around a lot, and maybe people don't really understand what that means and why it connects right to 6 degrees of segregation that you mentioned earlier.
It's such a phenomenal question, particularly now, Dr. Whitehead. I think about literally a book you wrote, The Letter to Your Sons. My life is the canvas upon which I write my stories. So when I think about critical race theory, it's about what Melisandre just shared, what Dr. Middlemass was sharing, what we share as people of color in our experience, and having a theoretical construct that speaks to that in meaningful ways that dissects our reality. And that history is important to that reality. It's why I think when we talk about here in Minnesota in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, I found myself giving a lot of presentations, not on terminology like anti-bias or cultural bias. I wanted to talk about historical recovery, because what I found is that so many people have drunk the Kool-Aid about what our national narrative is, that it's hard for them to imagine policies like redlining had actual impact in or responsible for the decimation, the destruction of stable Black communities across the country. Here in Minnesota, St. Paul, we had the example of the Rondo neighborhood, where they ran the interstate through the neighborhood here, displaced 399 Black families, 60, 80 Black businesses. I'm now on a commission here with the city of St. Paul, working on reparations for that community. People said, well, why focus there? I said, well, look, we can talk about slavery, which a lot of people on this committee wanted to do. A lot of activists locally were like, we want to talk about reparations for slavery. And I said, and critical race theory kind of weaves through this in terms of its focus on the law, or at least beginning in this construct of the law. In terms of what's justiciable and where I can prove harm, I got a heck of an argument with regard to what happened 40, 50 years ago. And I can find those 399 families. I can document the harm that was done. I can calibrate for the loss of property. I can talk about how to, and then we're talking about accountability for that. Once I establish that as a precedent, then I'm going back and I'm where, as Melisandre talked about, then a position to talk about all the other things that have contributed to this, but following that on a continuum. I think critical race theory is under assault primarily because there are those who are uncomfortable with grappling with the narrative in a way that deals with the wound and trauma that you talked about in that powerful book. And I return to that book often. I think I would argue it's a book that, and you were at that time talking about where we were in terms of a so-called post-racial America. Where are we now, post-pandemic, post-George Floyd, where I can see a lot of celebratory laps being taken now in terms of, well, no more Donald Trump and no more, pandemic and Officer Chauvin is guilty. Now we're post-racial, and not quite. We still have to have these difficult conversations about the wound that produces the narrative. But last but not least, I think it is that reconciling with the history that's uncomfortable that leads people to want to reaffirm their comfortable narrative about what America is and what it represents. what it's been for them and not its shortcomings. And I think that's why you get that response to 1619 of the president trying to push through last September a commission to tell history, you know, in the acceptable format that, you know, Tim Scott the other night after Biden's address talking about America's not a racist society. I mean, it is this legerdemain about, you know, let's look over here, you know, and the trick is if we can convince you that there's abundant opportunity here for everyone, we don't have to deal with the issue of race. And more importantly, we don't have to deal with the issue of class. We don't have to deal with the issue of gender. We don't have to deal with any of these issues because we know race remains the third rail in American politics and culture, which is why when you wrote in that book, we have to raise our children to be fighters. In this moment, more important than any other moment, perhaps in our history, we can't let down our guard and give up the fight.
Then Dr. Keisha, I got to bring you into this because I know that you look at policing and think about that. So during the time of the Derek Chauvin trial, which Dr. Uhura put on the table, which I appreciate, names came up, the same situation. So we could barely sit through that trial as they replayed that video. And we know that, you know, we live in a country where people love to see our pain. You know, the fact that that murder was watched 1.4 billion times, and then the start of the Chauvin trial, another 50 million times. And while we were reeling from that, Dante Wright, the 20-year-old, was shot. Ma'Khia Bryant, 16 years old. Adam Toledo, 13 years old. Andrew Brown Jr., father of 7, 42 years old. And then Isaiah Brown, who's still fighting for his life. We could not stop. Can you address the elephant in the room, which is about policing, even though we know that putting one bad rogue police officer in jail will not stop police brutality?
Yes. The Chauvin trial brought a lot of Black pain through the video and the murder of George Floyd. And unfortunately, that becomes a form of entertainment, which then allows elected officials in particular, but also public people in the public space to use misinformation about race or class or gender or sexual identity and differences to marginalize people. So when you start thinking about policing, we have to go back to the actual slave trade and how Black people were policed to ensure that they were not able to organize. And the slaveholders and literally the slave patrols is what formulated the first police departments in the South. In the North, we also had police departments. They formed a little bit earlier over from England, but the whole idea was to police others. And so when we get to this idea of what policing is and that one bad apple, I'd really like to focus on the misinformation about Black people. Is when the media, and the media is to blame for some of this, is when the media puts up the actual criminal record of a Black person who has been murdered by the police versus the white man gets his graduation picture put on film, or sorry, put on the TV, even though they've committed crimes.
Right.
And that then image becomes what the larger society believes of Black people. And so when we think about like misinformation and fake news in the political spectrum, we also have to get into what is fake news, misinformation, disinformation about who Black people are and which ones are valued. It seems that we're valued for very few things: athletic prowess, entertainment, music, art, dancing. And then after that, there's this big drop off as to which Black people are valued. And we know Black men have been demonized. We know Black women are demonized. And unfortunately, policing, media, society have now demonized Black children, making it, and I put in quotations, acceptable for the police to shoot children at a park playing with whatever children do play with. And those individuals are not human first. They're criminal, they're bad, or they're Black before they're human.
Melisande, then in bringing you back into the conversation, as we think about Black pain and suffering, as someone who is a descendant of Jesuit enslavement, What are the ways that we can take both our collective pain and our individual pain and turn that into power so that we can begin to move ourselves and our communities forward?
Well, thank you for the question. I believe that my existence is an act of resistance. Therefore, I am going to take the best possible care of myself that I can, as did every generation of us who came before me, 11 generations, going back to the 1600s in me. We survived, and yes, it was difficult, and yes, there was hardship, and yes, the cards are stacked against us by the people who can stack the cards, and those are the people who come through institutions of higher learning, who go out and become lawmakers and policymakers in our society. And we cannot and do not hold them accountable by participating despite the difficulty imposed on you. You keep moving through it and you keep doing it. And I keep doing it because every one of my ancestors, I've only spoken about my heavenly grandmothers lately, my paternal fathers and ancestors are their own human story, but we survived. And throughout the hardships, I'm going to show up every day in these people's face and say, I'm still here. I have never, and we continue in 2021 to frame our existence on something that we know is a lie, and that's race. Because if you peel all of us, we are no longer waterproof, and we about 15 minutes away from catching a whole bunch of stuff that's gonna kill you dead. I'm grateful for my skin. I'm grateful for everybody's skin, because without it, who's gonna be here? Black people were not dehumanized by white people. White people dehumanized themselves to think that they are better than everybody else. You can't take my humanity from me. I know who I am. I know who I am because everything about my existence from the day I was born has informed who I am 67 years later. I have never known, not known since I was 4 years old about Emmett Till. I didn't get to skip over this. So the same racism, aberrant and violent in my childhood is the same in my adulthood. The idea that we skipped over some parts is a lie. And who tells the lie and why?
Now that's really interesting. And Dr. Uhura, I want to pull you back in because I like what Millicent said about race, except that we know race is a point of tension. We know that race is a driving force. We know that race gets codified into law and therefore either extends or denies access to the rooms where it happened. So in kind of dissecting that race piece for just a moment, can you talk about the ways in which we're trying to be anti-racist? And I say that with a smile. That's the new buzzword, right? You and I both know it used to be about diversity, then it was about equality, then it was about equity. Now it's about let's all be anti-racist and let's do podcasts and books about that without doing the hard work. So if you could draw a line for me, Dr. Huro, between the differences between, I don't know, performative wokeness around being anti-racist and actually doing the hard work, what does that look like?
It's a phenomenal question, and I agree with you about the performative elements that we associate with so much of diversity training. I would say I was so enjoying Millicent's description here, because when we think about Jesuit education, you think about those core values, we ask students to examine who am I, whose am I, and who am I called to be. She just demonstrated what anti-racism or multiculturalism or insert label here looks like in her recitation of what has defined her on the 67 years in the planet that brings her to this point where she can say definitively, because of my knowledge of history, because of my culture, because of my experiences, these are the things that I choose to fight, because I recognize that they embed within our society and culture division, which is not healthy for me, was not healthy for my ancestors, and oh, by the way, ain't really healthy for anybody in terms of our democracy, in terms of our spirituality, in terms of our economy. The vibrancy of everything is challenged by virtue of the fact that we perpetuate misconceptions or mythologies about the meaning of race. Having said that, critical race theory, to go back to this, is so essential because it centers race in a way that we then can't escape what Dr. Middlemass was talking about, how race has been central to the definition of criminal justice. I sometimes have to remind my students when we're looking at the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, and I ask them, you know, Eugene Bull Connor wasn't the police chief, he was the commissioner of public safety, because public safety was about enforcing segregation. You know, all those ordinances going back to the Supreme Court's decision in the slaughterhouse cases and defining, you know, race and enforcement of racial identity as part of the policing system. This idea that, you know, states could do this, legislate on health, safety, and morals, and you define race as a morals question or a safety question, then you've opened a can of worms. But to your point, it is touched all aspects of our society and culture, from education to the courts to politics. And when we understand it in that way, the process of dismantling can't come by virtue of the new buzzword. I just was on with Professor Kendi last week. He did a keynote and we were in conversation. And I actually love him. I prefer STAMP from the beginning to How to Be an Anti-Racist, because STAMP is helping me navigate the ideas, the policies and practices, the ideas that inform those policies and practices that have reduced us to what Millicent talked about in our contemporary moment. The quick reaction to this, that universities are simply going to now create centers for reconciliation, or going to have critical, courageous conversations about race and emerge on the other side in just a few short weeks, to be a fundamentally different entity, is a fallacy of the highest order, which will do us a disservice. It is longitudinal work that requires a commitment to the hiring of diverse faculty, that requires a reimagination of the curriculum. In fact, I'll use a stronger term, decolonization of the curriculum. That requires university to move away from the model of the ivory tower and to interlace with the life of the community. And then requires us to reimagine, which Kendi talks about in How to Be an Anti-Racist, our curriculum in ways that privilege our shared humanity, but don't lose sight of the critical elements of our history that have produced the tensions that you talked about. Last but not least, I think about it in this way. Last summer, in probably one of his finest moments, and I'm not a huge fan of Al Sharpton, but I will say he nailed it last year when he said, George Floyd's story has been the story of Black folks in America. When we don't know our history, when we're not seeing whiteness as property, we miss sometimes that through line that runs through all of us, our personal narratives, as Millicent has demonstrated, and kind of the meta narratives that we use. Very quick example, last year in the middle of the pandemic, I'd always heard my great grandfather was murdered. I decided to look into this. I've always run from it, but I wanted to know what happened. And so going back and looking at that story, he was killed in Danville, Virginia in 1937. I discovered that he was over-policed. So the month before he was murdered, the police were harassing him. They fined him for using profanity on the phone. The sum of $24, which would be the equivalent of $450 in 2021 money. I mean, you know, literally that would have bankrupted him. After he was killed, his brother-in-law took up for the family, and then he was murdered 8 months later. And then his brother-in-law, then his brother-in-law took over they had a grocery. They were actually running a grocery store, which was important for me to see because I'm like, wow, my great grandfather was an entrepreneur before somebody took his life. Well, the month after that happens is April of 1938. That brother-in-law, Charles Fitzgerald, gets involved in a high-speed chase with police. They claimed he was driving on a suspended license. They claimed that he had moonshine in the vehicle. He's with another Black passenger. They were about to cross the state line into North Carolina, and the police shot out his tire. The car flipped, hit a tractor carrying 2 white farmers, and all 4 men were killed. At this point, the North Carolina officials actually charged the 2 white officers who had done this with manslaughter. And I'm like, whoa, like this is justice and accountability. But at trial, the North Carolina, essentially what they determined was that, and the 2 officers actually continued to work throughout the trial in Virginia as they were being tried in North Carolina. What they concluded at the trial is that the 2 white officers were actually justified in their actions, that they did not violate any law by firing at the vehicle. And more importantly, if anyone was accountable for the death of the 2 white farmers, it was the 2 quote unquote Negroes who had been using excessive speed, which necessitated the officers to fire at their vehicle. That to me was Dante Wright, thinking about this now, being pulled over for an air freshener. And so wounds produce narratives. We really have to understand those wounds and where they come from. And we need to understand them in the context of the Emmett Tills and in terms of our personal histories, which in the case of Melissa, I learned so much reading about your story and how you have done that deep work to understand how the ancestors continue to speak to us. And they continue to point in a powerful way, as John Lewis reminded all of us last summer in his final letter to the American people, that without history and without knowing that, they're telling us what needs to be dismantled. We just have to pay attention, recalibrate, and do that hard longitudinal work.
Oh, that's excellent. I'm just thinking about, the waves around what you've laid out about your family, about knowing your history, about why it's important to have our young people go to places like Howard so they can focus on studying about our genius, so that it's not just a part of the curriculum, it is the curriculum. And so Dr. Keisha, just coming to you, because I love that, wounds produce narratives. I thought very deeply about Dr. King, as I do a lot, and not the Dr. King of the whitewashed American holiday, right? The old man who had a dream that didn't come true, pulling quarters out of your ear. Not that Dr. King, but the radical revolutionary Dr. King, the Black liberationist Dr. King, who said that there were 3 evils that America had to dismantle if Black folks ever want to get free, right? So it was the evil of racism. And I like the fact that he used the word evil coming out of the Christian tradition. It was the evil of poverty, which to me connects directly to the evil of capitalism. And there was the evil of militarism, which connects directly to the way in which our police officers are militarized in this country. That until we dismantle that, there won't be any freedom. But Dr. Keisha, it feels like we are striking at the limb and we can't get to the roots here. So can you talk a little bit about that? How do we sustain ourselves to get through the limbs so we can actually get down into the root and the soil of the racism in this country?
I think you have just nailed the challenge of race and how race is incorporated in American society is because we as a whole, as a collective, but mostly the white power structure, has only examined or only wants to pick the leaves off of the farthest branches. They will cut off a branch, but they will never actually get to the foundational issues that make race so apparent when you actually study history and you study the political calculations that the founding fathers made. If you study the Constitution not as a political document, but as a human document, and you start reading the actual clauses and amendments that refer to Black people as 3/5 of a person, so white people will be represented in Congress and the House of Representatives. We have to know history to then understand how much it is repeated. And we don't actually have to go back that far. We are only 2 generations removed from individuals that lived in a segregated community, went to segregated schools. We don't have to go back in time, as Dr. Williams' story about his family just demonstrated. It was his grandfather. We're not talking about ancient history, and when you're talking to students, ancient history was the 1980s, but I won't dwell with that. The idea is that we have repeated Black pain, and it is just repeated. And we have maybe people held accountable. But if white people are accountable for Black pain, the punishment is minimal and compared to Black pain inflicted by whites. So this whole idea of getting to the actual roots of racism is one we have to, I find myself as a teacher and as a mentor, that I have to have my students comfortable talking about racism and separating out race, because we have other issues to sort of tackle, but we have to understand racism to then understand the role of race and how race has been codified, as you've mentioned, how it's been incorporated into public policies. But I also want students to understand that, and this is really the foundational part of that tree, is how language can be used and have a racist impact, but no one talks about race. They use the terms public safety. Now we're talking about election integrity. Now we're talking about this idea of, well, we need more cameras to protect people. And I always think to myself, the police show up after the crime. So what really are police protecting? And so if we look at history, recent history, we see this repetition, but to get to the foundation, we actually have to look at the language people use to understand how language can be racist. And once we then get that point, we can actually start breaking down how racism is inflicted and used in multiple areas. And unfortunately, a lot of white people don't know, and Black people don't know, that it is actually racism that then produces these unequal outcomes.
Oh, thank you for that. Millicent, I want to just ask you about this idea of generational pain, because I think that anything that deals with reconciliation and systemic racism has to also address our pain. Dr. Charles McKinney, who's at Rose College in Memphis, Tennessee, wrote something on his Facebook page that has just stayed with me and has haunted me in so many ways. He said that, his father was talking about Emmett Till, and he was talking about Rodney King and Amadou Diallo, and his son is now talking about George Floyd and Mike Brown and Tamir Rice. That's 3 generations all at the same table talking about key incidences when Black men have been killed or beat close to the end of their life. That kind of generational pain. Can you talk about the way in which we can break that cycle? What does self-care, what does joy, what does happiness, we don't often talk about, what does that look like for Black people, even in the midst of these very oppressive and almost dangerous situations?
Dr. Whitehead, thank you so much for that question. I am a Black woman, and Black women have always been central and fundamental to our lives in Black America as Black people. The original problems of voting in America was an issue, an exception that was taken against Black men having the vote, not Black men and women having the vote. Black women, then that ushered in white women joining with oppressive racist forces to promote their agenda, and then voting in years of lawmakers who were men who continued institutional racist practices for their benefit in the United States of America. Our history as a nation is 245 years old. We don't need to go back to Moses and the bulrushes, Jesus on the cross, or the Romans. Leave the Egyptians out of it. Let us speak specifically about the conditions formatted in the Constitution of the United States of America by Congress, by the Senate, and the institutions that educated those people to go out into society and create this society of disenfranchisement. I'm pretty narrow in my approach. The morality of it all is off the table for me. That's between you and your maker. Dr. King said it didn't cost America a thing to integrate lunch counters, take down white and colored signs, open up the bathrooms. That cost nothing. When it came to talking about the economics of a matter, he was a dead man shortly after. And the powers that have created this institution dangle being dead in front of all of us. And we get to pick and choose every day what we gonna do.
So Dr. Uhuru, with thinking about Dr. King, I immediately thought about the Kerner Commission and the ways in which we wrestle with that document. I mean, I think anytime you have all white men go figure out what Black people want, you're gonna have something you're gonna wrestle with, right? But one of the things that they said in terms of thinking about what it is that Black people wanted, right? That was really Lyndon Baines Johnson's question. Like, how do we get them to stop burning down their communities and be grateful? And when they came back and said, really, it was a couple of things that the Black community said, you know what, if we get these things, we can really begin to move towards bringing some real equality and equity. If you pour money into the Black communities, if you pump money into Black schools, and if you raise the wages so that Black folks are on par with their white counterparts back in 1968, you know, we can kind of move some things along. That study was redone 30 years later with the Eisenhower Foundation. And since 1998, the world has moved on. And how's the Black community doing? And in 1998, where they say, well, really, you got to pour some money into the Black communities. You got to pump some money into Black schools, and you got to raise the wages so that Black folks and brown folks are on par with white folks. Okay, 50 years later, they did it again in 2018. And they said, okay, so how are Black folks doing? And it's been 50 years since the Kerner Commission. Now, in the midst of everything they said we needed, the three that struck me is that you got to pour some money into the Black communities. You got to pour money into inner city, predominantly Black, economically challenged schools. And you got to raise the wages of Black and brown folks. Okay, so nothing has changed. The policies have changed. The laws have changed. But that final frontier, which is the hearts and minds of white folks in this country, that has not changed in the places that would bring about fundamental differences in the lives of Black and brown people. So can you connect that for us to this notion of reconciliation that we're trying to get to today, thinking about the Jesuit examen?
It's a brilliant question, and it's true. And I think it requires us to think about this in a couple of different ways. I love talking about Dr. King in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, where he essentially says, we made a grievous error in the way that we were talking about civil rights in this country because we were so focused narrowly on access and opportunity, we missed an important grain of consistency, which is simply this. What good is it to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford anything on the menu? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. What good is it to have the right to go to university if you can't afford tuition? Civil rights without economic justice are empty. And to Millicent's point, which I think is brilliant, would it really cost you anything, given particularly certain institutions, to create a policy of inclusivity that would allow for scholarships and financial reparations to allow not only the descendants of those who may have been enslaved, but also to just redress in the larger community as a whole the damage that's been done to people of color by virtue of these policies, practices, and procedures that have themselves been embedded in the universities. And Millicent we had a great riff on that earlier. I will not even try to add to her brilliance. What I will say in terms of universities in this moment, particularly Jesuit colleges and universities, is that the missions of these institutions speak powerfully and align powerfully with what Dr. King talked about in a speech that he gave to the American Psychological Association in 1967 on creative maladjustment. And essentially what King argues, there's some things in this world to which we should never be adjusted. Militarism, which people don't often see police violence as an expression of that. But as you wrote about in Race Brave, when you have officers in Eric Garner case walking around looking like the military, right? That's not just echoes of the past, that's militarism. When you have police outfitted in Maryland and in those spaces looking like the military instead of looking like officers of the law. There's also this part of this, I think, that goes back to what Pedro Arrupe wrote about in 1973 in Men and Women for Others, or Women and Men for Others. And of course, it was sexist in that moment. He wasn't addressing women specifically, but I would argue that everybody, all Jesuit colleges and universities, need to revisit Arrupe for the 21st century in this moment, in the shadow of the pandemic, in the shadow of George Floyd, and to interrogate those three principles that he laid out in that powerful piece that begin with this question of, and he names it, what is privilege? So move away from white privilege. Arrupe was asking, Catholics, Jesuits in 1973, what does it mean to have privilege? We all have a degree of privilege. The way I try to explain white privilege to white men sometimes is talk about male privilege, right? And then they go, oh, well, and I'm comfortable acknowledging the ways in which my life is easier by virtue of the fact that my chromosomes are aligned a particular way, and there's certain struggles that I don't have based on that. And if I can understand that, certainly then you can understand that there are certain advantages that are afforded to you, and that's part of what Arrupe was saying, is to the degree that we become comfortable, very similar with Dr. King, with being uncomfortable about talking about inequality, we can actually move our society forward. I love using Arrupe as the model here, because if anybody, because we all teach in spaces, unfortunately, where people will come and they want to be the catechism police or whatever it may be. And I use catechism, it might be the Constitution police, it might be the faculty handbook police, whatever the document is that says we can't talk about this. I'll go back to what Millicent said. It is essentially a moral question which at its core speaks to the heart of the mission statement of all of the members of the AJCU, which is, if we are educating young people to be morally responsible leaders who can impact the society in which they live, because they bring a broad perspective informed by the Catholic intellectual tradition that is deeply embedded in the humanities, that has a deep appreciation, not for the exploitation of human beings, but for the elevation of life.
Oh, I love that. So Dr. Keisha, I want to come to you. I know that we don't have much time, but in thinking about, we put Dr. King, we talked about it, but I'm going to put Ella Baker on the table, because Ella Baker, who, of course, and her work, her organizing, her skill, her talent, her ability to move people on the path, said something that was made into a song by Sweet Honey in the Rock. And she said that until the killing of Black boys, Black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white boys, white mothers' sons, then we who believe in freedom cannot rest. My question for you, Dr. Keisha, what does rest look like for Black and brown people? Like, we've never imagined what rest would look like. And coming out of a global pandemic, if we are coming out of it, resting is something we need to think about in terms of Black revolutionary self-care.
Yes, rest seems to be an elusive concept right now for particularly Black people. We started at the top about just coming out of the Chauvin trial and just the constant Black pain that was on social media, on traditional media, that it really does mean to step away and say no, to be, as we've talked during this panel, is we show up every day. It is a radical event. It's a radical sign, but also to be able to remove ourselves and say, no, I'm unavailable to do certain type of work. Particularly, and I'm particularly talking to Black and brown faculty on predominantly white campuses, is constantly having chairs or deans or other administrators ask the Black faculty to speak about race or to speak throughout, Black History Month, or to speak when there's a instance of police violence towards Black people, is exhausting. And just as a side note, I did not realize how exhausting it was until I came to Howard University. And all of a sudden, I was no longer the only Black political scientist. I was no longer the only prominent Black social scientist on campus, that I wasn't being asked to speak at every single event. And I did not realize that was rest for me, that I could process this Black public pain because I did not have to put on my warrior suit to go and talk to predominantly white audiences about Black pain. So just a call to administrators, deans, chairs, is recognize your Black faculty, your Black and brown faculty, recognize that they are exhausted and tired in ways that has nothing to do with the teaching and administration of who we are as faculty, but just we're exhausted based on who we are as a people, and that we should be excused for having to show up all the time.
Melissa, I want to come to you to just talk with us as we're trying to process our pain. And unfortunately, we have to process our pain publicly because it's just a part of the ongoing narrative, the onslaught against Black folks. I'd like you to kind of address two things. Can you talk with us about the ways in which we can process this and use it as a point to move us forward in this narrative? And then second, can you talk about a resource that can help people along the way?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Whitehead. I can use myself, I guess, best as an example, and the things that I do. In the processing of my pain and our collective pain, I look to our accomplishments and what we have done and what we have overcome and how we continue to push despite overwhelming odds and resistance. Resistance is futile. You can make it hard, you can continue to make it hard. But I know that when I show up, I got all my ancestors coming with me. And just like they called my name, they are calling the names of all of us, all over, to step up and do what you got to do. We have one lifetime. Theoretically, we're going to be reunited with absentee dad and have some pie in the sky by and by. But right here, right now, put on your 10 league boots and step into your grown-up pants and get it, make it happen. And no, you may not accomplish this in your lifetime. That does not diminish or take away from your responsibility of a lifetime.
So
that's what I do. And I take care of myself. And I say, no, my great-grandmother, who was brought into the world and delivered into the hands of a young woman who was sold to Louisiana in 1838, told me all of my life when I was a little girl to wear the world like a loose garment and to shrug it off when it's time for you not to wear it, and to pick it back up and put it back on when you've had your rest. So I got my coat hanging over.
Thank you so much. Millicent Short-Colomb is a research and community engagement associate with Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, a descendant of Jesuit enslavement and human trafficking. I come to you now, Dr. Uhura Williams. If you could give us a resource, a book or two that you think people should read as they're starting to kind of figure this out.
I'm going to suggest three very quickly. If you want to understand the wound, what we mean by wounds produce narratives, I would actually start with Letters to My Black Sons. If you really want to understand that in a way that's personal and will allow you to reflect on, and you know, we could talk about Citizen, we could talk about other books, but I think people have to understand that in a way that communicates it from the pain of family, particularly when we're talking about this in Jesuit institutions. That book is very compelling, will do that. I would also recommend Ibram Kendi, and that's by Dr. Whitehead. The second is Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning. I think it's important that people deal with and wrestle with the history of racist ideas in this country. You can't be anti-racist until you understand the wound, and you can't understand the wound unless you have been in some way exposed to that pain in an intellectual but yet still raw and compelling way, which letters will give you, but then also in that intellectual, let's walk through what Jefferson said and what this person said and what that, which is what Kendi will give you. And then last but not least, I think I said it earlier, I read Arupe once a month. I just think that we need to be, from 1973, read up in Arupe in 2021. So much of what we've experienced in the last year, from responding to the global pandemic, to the Capitol insurrection, to voting irregularities, to race, and the issue of policing in this country, were addressed by him in the margins of that work. If you read it directly and in between the lines, it's a powerful call to action in our contemporary moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Uhura Williams, Distinguished University Chair and Professor of History and Founding Director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I'm humbled that you include my book. Thank you so much for that blessing, because that is definitely something that'll make me smile throughout the rest of the day. Dr. Keisha Middlemass, I'll come to you last. Could you recommend a few resources, one or two books, an article, a video, something you think people can watch, read, share that will help them along the way?
When you're wrestling with the criminal justice system and all of its tentacles within the United States, I think an important film to watch is 13th. It looks at the intersection of race and justice and mass incarceration in the United States. If you're interested in the convergence of race and public policies and elections and politicians, I'm going to do a plug of my own book, Convicted and Condemned, The Politics and Policies of Prisoner Reentry. So what I do is I weave the history of race and the creation of public policies and how Black people are targeted. And then I weave together the narratives of Black men and women that are coming home from prison to explain how detrimental the policies are to the individual, their families, and communities. And lastly, for history, All God's Children by Fox Butterfield. He looks at the cumulative effect of racism and violence over 4 or 5 generations of African Americans, mostly in South Carolina, but it could literally be a testament to the Black pain that we've been talking about during this panel discussion.
Thank you so very much. Dr. Keisha Middlemass is an associate professor at Howard University in the Department of Political Science. She studies public policies, the criminal justice system, and prisoner reentry. I would add to that something that I think Toni Morrison said, that if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you need to write it. I tell people, as you're reading work, also think about writing your story, your textual lineage beyond just your Facebook posts, beyond just your tweets, which for me are all part of my textual lineage, knowing that years from now, that as my sons take over my Facebook page, as I tell them they have to do at some point, that it's going to pop up, that this is what happened on this day 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And what I hope, believe it or not, with my Facebook is I'm hoping that my sons will see a legacy of love in the everyday care of being a Black mother. That, as someone wrote, I take off my coat to protect you from the rain and you don't even realize why you're not getting wet. It's because my coat is there. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. In our panel, the call to reconciliation and racial justice. Please stay around because we will have a live question and answer series, and we're delighted to hear from you.